You know, I should start out by saying that I came here tonight with a very prepared speech, and I'm not going to use it. Tonight, you will forgive me because to the extent that you are with me and we are together, I am going to ramble. And to the extent that we are not together and it is late and we shouldn't be together too long, I'll stop rambling. I am very moved tonight for several reasons. The first and perhaps as important as the others has been a question of personal memory. When I walked in and David Rothschild told me that Oriva was going to talk, I had a poignant memory associated with his name, not with his, but with that of Zanu, because Chitepo, my good friend, was with me as I told him just about a month before he was murdered. And we spent 3 days together talking about the liberation movements in Southern Africa. And it was very good to have you here, because I think it's important for what we are trying to do to know that there is an organic link between the struggle of the people of Southern Africa and that of the United States. I have a sense of optimism and despair, a feeling of tiredness and hope, all at the same time, perhaps because I'm half drunk. And the effects are wearing out. Let me mention one small disappointment. I wish that at this forum there was a greater representation on the last day of this long teaching of women, of black people, and of Indians on this panel than there actually was. I wish us also that speakers, all of us, had tried to drive an organic link between your struggle at home and our struggle abroad. But there is a lot to be hopeful about. Somebody asked me as I walked in here if I have been to Ann Arbor before. And the answer was, of course, many times. And one of the times that I remember, and I remember it because there is an organic link between that time and tonight, was late in 1964, when we had to begin to organize the teaching movement against the war in Indochina. And even those of you who were not at the university at the time would remember that this is where it began. And it was a good thing to begin. And there were some simple things behind it, and that was a very important, crazy belief in the ultimate usefulness of speaking to the people. Despite what looked like an unbreakable Cold War consensus, despite what looked like the unbreakable, untouchable corporate university, one began in a small way and it worked. And I was one of those fortunate people who spoke at the first teach-in in Michigan, Ann Arbor. But between 1964 and tonight, in the last 3 days, there is a difference, and the difference, I think, speaks for a hope. And I do want to mention that. The teaching on Vietnam was an act of moral concern, and in some limited ways, an expression of personal concern. One was horrified by the specific immorality of the war in Indochina. One was wanting to protest against it. One was not willing to be hooked into it because of the consensus over the Cold War. But one had, especially people your age had, in the back of their minds, the simple fact that came out 2 years later, that they were going to have to fight in that war. And a sort of unspoken anti-imperialist consensus was beginning to build up on a specific issue of Vietnam. Well, you know the history of the last 10 years. The war in Indochina has done a lot of things. It broke the consensus about the Cold War. It destroyed the theology of anti-communism. It produced a new generation of young people and of radicals who were willing to say no to inherited wisdom. It produced Watergate. It produced 55,000 dead, 250,000 people wounded, of Americans. And of course, nobody counted the Asians dying, not even in that the most computerized of all wars. What inspires me about this teaching is that it gives us the first example, and I have been to several over the last 6 years. It gives us a feeling that the lessons that have been learned from the movement against the war in Indochina are not totally lost to many people, particularly to young people in this country. And that there is a constituency of people, young men and young women, hopefully young men and women of working class constituencies also, throughout this country, who are willing to move from the specifics of a war in Indochina to the question of imperialism abroad and its relationship to repression and erosion of freedoms at home. And that's why the simple sight, the simple witness of 2,000 people here attending this teaching is a very hopeful sign. Because essentially what it means that you have stayed until 11 o'clock, 11, what is it, 11:15 or so, 11 o'clock. tonight through these speeches, through 3 days of meeting, because you want to know. We want all to share what is the relationship between our lives at home and imperialism and repression abroad. And this consciousness, this broadening of consciousness, as I think evidenced through this teaching, is important. It is important because we are beginning to learn that there are organic linkages between interventions and oppression abroad, and repression, oppression, and erosion of freedoms and of quality of life at home. When we begin to learn that, I think we can go from here to think about what to do next, so that this doesn't become, I hope, just one more thing to do. So, to the issues. The war in Indochina and the lessons of Indochina. I don't know how many of you have heard me before, but those of you who have would remember that once in a while, early in the 60s, I used to remind us all of that film that we had seen. And I used to say that you don't understand the war in Indochina because the Americans do not have a sense of the tragic. And because you don't have the sense of the tragic, you don't know what is happening to us in Asia, in Greece, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. And I used to use, I sometimes use the example of that film that used to come out before the main feature in the cinema halls. Don't know if you saw that one. It was a marvelous shot of about 15 minutes. That was a scene of fishing. You had this wonderful scene of a long, big, multicolored American car driven by a single individual driving through this wonderfully shaded road to the beach. He arrives at the beach, parks there, takes out his gear. Just this beautiful white beach with the blue sea and the blue sky above it, very inviting. He walks up to the beach, chooses a wonderful spot with rocks and water and sand, juxtaposition of the three. He throws his hooks in, starts fishing, and has a good day. You see him hooking the fish comes out, they wiggle, they get hooked, they wiggle. He closes them in, brings him out, takes him off the hook, puts in his big basket, throws it again, and you all enjoy it. We all see it. It's a wonderful scene. The sea is blue, so is the sky. The sand is white, and the rocks are lovely, and he is having a good day, and the fish moves, curbs in agony, gets hooked, gets caught, comes back. Ultimately, our fisherman gets a little bit hungry, opens his lunchbox, bites into his sandwich, and gets hooked. And you see him for the first time dragged into the sea, making the same movement that the fish was making. His body quivering, and he being dragged into the sea, and you don't laugh anymore. You don't watch the beauty of the sea. You don't look at the rocks and the sands. And this is for the first time that you see the agony of the fish from the point of view of the fish, because the fisherman has turned into the fish. And that was a problem, among many others. The problem of a country that had not known defeat, that had not known a war that could be visible to it. And then the war started coming home. And it came home in many forms. First in the form of the caskets that came home, the men on the crutches. It came home in the form of $200 billion lost on a war, fighting a people who would not lose. Finally, it began to come home to roost in the form of counterinsurgency chickens coming home to roost. Watergate was the result. I think one of the lessons of Vietnam that should be drawn, and I do not know if the universities are drawing it, that they should try to teach the people of America, the children of America, the meaning of tragedy, the meaning of agony, of war, of death, of exploitation, of oppression. For once, the invisible war should have become visible to them. I refer to Zanu and to Chitepo and to Moriwa because there are still invisible wars being fought. But to whom are they invisible? These are terms they have used, friends. I mean, I'm rambling. But these are terms they are used in Pentagon and in the State Department and by Dr. Kissinger and by President Ford and by President Nixon. They use terms like invisible wars. They used to say forgotten wars, a successful guerrilla war, a successful war of counterinsurgency is an invisible war. It's a forgotten war. Invisible to whom? The war in Laos was not invisible. And that's the crux of the national security problems. The war in Laos was not invisible to the Laotians, who received exactly the same amount of tonnage between 1964 and 1969 in 5 years. They received the same amount of tonnage in bombs that was expended in all of World War II by all the combatants. But the American people didn't know about it until '69, when the Mansfield report came out from the Senate, said that the American Air Force had been bombing Laos without the knowledge of the American public. So the invisible war was not invisible to the Laotians who were dying, half of whom were rendered homeless, 3/4 of whose villages had been destroyed by American bombing. It was invisible to the American public. And what does keeping a war invisible involve? It involves deceit, not of the Laotians. It involves killing the Laotians, but deceiving the American people. It involves covert operations. It involves the growing power of the CIA. It involves the growing power of the military. It involves the growing power for the Pentagon. It involves shifting military intelligence into naval intelligence into Air Force intelligence back to CIA, and CIA back to naval intelligence, and so on and so forth. It involves creating air forces and producing new armies paid by American taxpayers that Americans know nothing about. Essentially, what then it involves a subversion It involved a clear-cut, deliberate subversion of the democratic process by President Kennedy, by President Johnson, and ultimately Nixon got caught because he brought the chickens home to roost. The process has to stop. But the point is that it hasn't stopped. People from ZANU ought to know, and they do know, and who was involved in the murder of Chitapur. They ought to know, and they do know, who is supporting the FNLA in Angola today, and UNITA. They ought to know, and they do know, what the American expansion is in the Simonstown base as the British are pulling out. We should have talked about Southern Africa. And then they ought to know what the connection is between those covert operations there and the kind of thing that Watergate produces. A man cannot be violent. A man cannot be violent, incredibly violent to his mistress and sadistic to her, and be gentle to his wife. And a woman cannot be sadistic to her husband and be gentle to her child. These are organic linkages. There is a definite, present, and organic link between oppression abroad and ultimately the counter-revolutionary chickens abroad coming home to roost. So one single thing I do want to say is that when we talk about problems at home, we must try to understand that they are organically linked. When you think about your lives, your alienations, the economic problems in this country, let us not forget that they are deeply linked with American policies in the third world in particular and abroad generally. People are making economic analysis. I am shocked to see that there is very little discussion of what the war in Indochina has done to the economy of this country. People talk about the growing power of the executive. I am shocked to see how little we understand of what the war in Indochina has done to reinforcing the national security agencies, the CIA, the military, so on and so forth, and creating that psychology of paranoia that produced something like Watergate, or is producing something like this latest massacres that Mr. Ford is carrying out within his own family. So, to the third point, and I really would like you to stop me when you stop getting bored. Before we begin to talk about what we can do in the post-Vietnam period, I think there is a need to understand what the government, what the state is doing in the post-Vietnam period. There I will make some very few pointers. One is that the American foreign policy as it has been developed under President Nixon and Dr. Henry Kissinger is probably one of the most cogent, the most coherent, and in a sense the most systematic definition of American strategy abroad, and therefore of American strategy at home, since the end of World War II. And the basic outlines of that strategy have to be understood. for us to be able to attack it properly. And it ties up with what Jeremy Rifkin was talking about with regard to the multinational corporations. We don't have the time, and you are very tired, to go into very great details of it. I would roughly point out that three ghosts have haunted the policymakers of the American state over the last 2 decades, and they still continue to haunt them. One is the USSR. They feel and have felt that in an American aim, if the American objective is to stay number one as a world power, which is to say, if the American corporations are going to rule the world and get that 54% that they want of the entire world's resources in year 2000, then there are certain kinds of dangers that exist which must be fought and must be resisted. The first is, and not in an order of priority, but the first is USSR. Because Russia, only of all the powers in the world today, has the geographic, geopolitical expanse, the technological capabilities, the demographic balance with the territorial expanse, and the expanse of territory stretching from Asia through Middle East to Europe, to be able to rival the resources of the United States. And therefore, the Russians pose a major threat and a major rival in future to American hegemony in the world. Now, this has been true of the Cold War analysts since 1948, or even earlier. The difference, however, is that Dr. Henry Kissinger and President Nixon, and to a certain extent Rockefeller and Ford, had a somewhat more sophisticated view of USSR, which is that Kissinger has always made the distinction between a revolutionary power and a legitimate power. Previously, they had defined USSR as a revolutionary power. Now, they think of USSR as a transitional power, which is sort of semi-revolutionary power, which is quite capable of acting like a legitimate power. And therefore, the policy of détente is essentially a policy of confrontation in those areas which are strategic to American interests, and collaboration with USSR in those areas which are not strategic to American interests. The policy then of offering selective rewards, selective co-optation to USSR in order to reinforce its capability to act as a responsible world government, world power. But at the same time, a policy of confronting it with as much force as one can bear to bring upon it in those areas which are of a strategic interest to the United States, and the most clear examples to cite will be Southern Africa and the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean regions generally, the Middle East. The Middle East and Southern Africa. That's what policy of détente means. It's a policy of antagonistic collaboration. Now, when I use this word, what I think ought to be understood by us is that it is a policy of ambiguity. And ambiguity involves deception. Ambiguity involves deception of the public, it involves the deception of the Congress, it involves the deception of the enemy, and it involves the deception of the neutrals. That in itself has a whole lot of consequences attached to it, to domestic development. Second threat, the second ghost that has haunted policymakers in this country has been the threat of the liberation movements in the third world countries. This is where 54% of United States resources come from. And liberation movements have been particularly threatening for a very simple reason. Unlike nationalist governments, unlike monarchies like Saudi Arabia, or unlike radical nationalists like Abdul Nasser, ultimately, nationalist governments, revolutionary governments are nationalist in a genuine sense of the word, which is to say they want to socialize and nationalize national resources. And the price for socializing national resources is getting rid of the corporations, getting rid of foreign influence. Hence, there is a continued feeling of threat from the national liberation movements and the emergence of liberation forces in the third world countries. What is Kissinger's formula for it? Oh, he has a very simple phrase for it. He has used the term, and I'm quoting him, that in order to be able to police the world against revolutionary forces, you have to find, define, and make a stick. Now I'm quoting him exactly, a legitimizing principle of social repression. You have to find, define, and make a stick, a legitimizing principle of social repression. Now that is what has been lost. What was the legitimizing principle of social repression before the war in Indochina? Well, the doctrine of limited wars. It was the doctrine of limited wars, the doctrine that they called of invisible wars, of forgotten wars, of interventions that will not be noticed. Well, what is important about war in Indochina was that the war that was supposed to be limited became limited. Oh, Jesus Christ, limited for whom? The doctrine of limited war that was applied through the 40s and the 50s and the 60s was limited for whom? Certainly not for the Indochinese, not for the Laotians, Cambodians, and the Vietnamese, not for the people of the Dominican Republic, not for the people of Nicaragua, not for the people of Iran, for whom the war was unlimited. Because their very hope for a just social order was denied to them. Sometimes, as in the case of Indochina, at the price of bombs, destructions, movement of population, and so on. So the war was limited in its consequences, not for the people who were the victims of it, but for the country and the people which was committing those crimes, that was waging that war. In other words, the limited wars were limited only in their consequences for the intervening power and not for the people who were intervened against. The doctrine of limited war was absolutely exploded by war in Indochina, because the war that was supposed to be limited became unlimited in its consequences for the United States. It cost them 55,000 dead. It cost them 250,000 wounded. It cost them $200 billion in money. It cost them a broken down economy and a broken down dollar in Europe. Unlimited. And more, it cost them dissent at home. Kids burning draft cards, priests going to jail, stupid people like Eqbal Ahmad going to trial on charges of kidnapping Henry Kissinger. That's what it cost them. It was unlimited in its consequences. The war that was supposed to be invisible became visible. And as the war abroad became visible, the war at home became visible. You know, if I can take 1 minute out on a tangent, I want to tell you something. When Attica happened, you said, Jesus Christ, something new is happening in this country. You know, I'm not a violent guy, I'm a very peaceful son of a bitch. I really am, basically. You know, I just sometimes am afraid that, you know, we are forced into taking up guns and fighting. You know, one doesn't want to do that. Attica was very important. Because to me it was a very strange thing that happened for the first time in America since the Civil War. Attica. Prisoners stood there and they fought. They didn't kill those prisoners, those hostages they had taken. The hostages got killed by the state troopers and so on and so forth. What was important to me about Attica was a different thing, and that's why I'm trying to make the connection between Vietnam and things at home. You know, 2 years earlier, there was a story in the New York Times, and I'm sure that the Detroit papers also had it, about a prison in Arkansas. Some crazy social worker in Arkansas who was going in and out of prisons discovered or found out that some prisoner in Arkansas, which at that time was under the governor of Arkansas in those days was Rockefeller. Yeah, it was a Rockefeller. That's right. They discovered, that's right. Thanks a lot, sir. They discovered that some guy had been killed in prison and there was no record of the killing. Prison guards had murdered him and he disappeared. And this guy kept pushing and kept pushing and kept pushing, the social worker, and finally, you know, unearthed the story. And a state commission of inquiry was appointed. The commission went into the prison to inquire and ordered that the body should be, the courtyard of the prison should be dug to search for the body of that guy. Well, they found 27 other bodies. They found 27 other bodies in that courtyard. So there were prisons in Arkansas dying in an invisible war that nobody had ever noticed. And when the guys dug in Attica, Tom Wicker has written a bestseller. That's what Vietnam did. It created the mood to a large extent, and it has set the precedence for invisible oppression to become visible, and we will work on it. So the question was, to come back to my earlier analysis, they feel that that legitimizing principle of social repression, the limited war, is gone. Vietnam has discredited it. They have to find a new legitimizing principle of social repression. What is it? And it's a very simple one. It's the Nixon Doctrine. And I will not go into details of it, it is running late. Basically, what the Nixon Doctrine means in the Third World is a concerted, organized, well-chalked out effort at creating new constellations of regional power in each region of a strategic interest to the United States based on developmental fascism. Based on developmental fascism. The idea of letting Asians control, police Asia, and letting Latin Americans control Latin America, and letting Middle Easterns control Middle East, and Africans control Africa, is the idea of supporting certain number of chosen police states in these countries. So you have Brazil. So you have Chile.
So you have Iran. So you have Saudi Arabia. So you have South Africa. And you can go on recalling them. The point I'm trying to make is that in a manner that was not being done in the 50s and the 60s, the Americans have always, the American government has always supported proto-fascist regimes in the Third World, from Spain to Vietnam, through Nicaragua to the Dominican Republic. But there was always a certain embarrassment, which was produced by the liberal rhetoric of freedom and democracy. That rhetoric of freedom and democracy is now being replaced by the rhetoric of peace, a generation of peace. And in the name of peace, we are going to have support of fascistic regimes, clear-cut, defined, uninhibited support of fascistic regimes like that of Brazil, like that of Iran, like that of Saudi Arabia, like that of South Africa, and so on. This is a trend that we must fully take into account. When I say that, I want to make one more point. If you look at the countries, if you simply look at the countries which the United States government has concentrated on for the last 5 years to be its major ally, to be the kingpin of the Nixon doctrine, to be the primates of Pax America in particular regional constellations of power, you will notice that the same countries which the Nixon doctrine is concentrating on for military and political purposes are also the countries that the corporations have chosen to be the export platform countries of the Third World. Here I would slightly differ with Rifkin, namely, look, the corporations are very powerful. They do own at the moment 39% of the world's resources. They do employ more people throughout the world than any particular government does. They do own more wealth than any government does, any particular government does, and so on and so forth. Yet there is a problem. Neither the international structure of states nor the legal structure of international law permits the state, the corporation, to keep its own army, to maintain its own navy, to maintain its own air force, which means that the corporations are remaining dependent on the power of particular states to police the world. To police the world. The United States is the primary power to police the world. And one of the lessons they have learned from Vietnam is that the army is not the only or the best way to police the world. They must emphasize the Air Force, more importantly, the Navy, so that if I were talking to you in great detail, I will point out that much of CIA's functions are being transferred at the moment to the naval intelligence. That's why nobody is worried about firing Colby, and nobody is really worried about the investigations of CIA. And in truth, the goddamn work was in Chile was not done by the CIA as much as it was done by naval intelligence, if those of us who have done their homework know it. So it means a sort of realignment of American military power. Third point, the corporations are moving out for reasons of profit, are moving out of this country. And that is a contradiction also with which the American state has to deal. You know, there was a time when capital followed labor. Then there was a time when labor followed capital. And once again, capital is following labor. Oh, one after another, manufacturing activities from these countries are being transferred to the export platform countries. Which means that they have got this double need of finding countries that can control their workforce in places like Brazil and Iran and Egypt and South Africa on the one hand. On the other hand, they have got to find increasing amount of police state techniques at home to deal with the workforce that is going to be increasingly unemployed. You see the connection I'm trying to drive at. Okay? We are dealing, in other words, and I don't really want to, I will cut it short, I don't want to take any more of your time. We are dealing with a situation in which we are all, Americans and non-Americans, Europeans, the third world people, and Americans, in the same boat. In a time of increasing scarcity, in a time of continued readjustments on the part of the corporations on the one hand, and the states that are allied to the corporations on the other, and therefore a realignment of peoples across frontiers, I think is very much needed. What I find very, very heartening about a teaching like this is that this is probably the first time in the last 2 decades that so many people have been gathered around the general global issues of what is the relationship between their lives and the lives of people generally abroad. And not just on a specific issue like the war in Indochina, so that this sort of hopefully points out to our enlarged, enhanced consciousness. The question is, what can we do with it? And there, forgive me for not saying too much. I'll say only a few things. Work begins at home. I looked at the list of speakers there, and I looked at the size of this audience when I came in, and I said to myself, Jesus Christ, it's a bloody large audience of students and faculty members, some faculty members. And this goddamn speakers list doesn't seem to have much people from the universities. So, you obviously, consciously or unconsciously, have sensed or feel that there is something the universities are not doing that they ought to be doing. Well, it poses some very specific problems to you. If they are not doing what they ought to be doing, you damn well shouldn't be thinking of it or feeling it in your consciousness or unconsciousness. You damn well should sit down, form groups, work out what the hell they are not doing that they ought to be doing, and make up your plans and demand it. How many people in this Department of Political Science and how many people in the departments of sociology, psychology, and anthropology are talking in a way that is relevant? These people, they drive me crazy. In the night, you know, I can't believe it. I come out of this university tradition. 1960s, I went to school in Princeton in 1950s. It was terrible. You know, I was going to this Middle Eastern Studies and Political Science department. They had chalked out. I mean, it was unbelievable. these professors and students, their graduate students, had chalked out all the proclivities and revolutionary tendencies and social change proclivities of every goddamn fucking tribe in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. They didn't know what the hell was happening to their own students, so that when in the 60s the student movement exploded on their stupid heads, they didn't know what was happening. They just didn't know what was happening. See, the point is that I've used strong words because I feel close to them, words like a stupid heads and so on. The point is that the universities have trained themselves. It is like a corporate, it's a mini government. It's a mini corporate government where there has been a huge amount of training in not to deal with relevant issues. Now, friends, I don't want to go too far. All I would say is that you should, if you cannot change your immediate local environment, which is, in the case of this audience, the university, if you can't figure out how to make demands and put pressure so that the courses will be more relevant, that professors will know what they are talking about, that they'll have their feet on the ground, then you got a problem. So figure out how we can change the university and turn them into genuine places of education. Education. And I would go a step further and be very liberal about it, rather than Marxist and Leninist and all that. Education defined in liberal terms, which is that the primary function of university education, this is how the liberals have defined it, is to demonstrate, manifest, and make clear to young people that there exist organic living links between the abstract principle and the individual and group behavior. So that when you talk of democracy, you practice it. When you talk of freedom, you live it. Then I think second thing that we can do as people who are fortunately or unfortunately involved with intellectual work is to really ask ourselves, is to ask, instead of getting ourselves defined by set structures, ask ourselves if the work that we are doing has some relevance to the realities with which we are dealing. Because the function of good intellectual work is to apprehend reality in order to change it. The third thing I would say, and I'm going to finish on that one. Third thing I would say is, look, I was going to talk at some length about the problems I see of organizing in America. But I'll come back to do it some other time. One thing that I do want to say is that impatience. When you are one of the most crazy people I know in the world, you have been so patient at this meeting. I couldn't take as many speakers as you have taken this evening. But you are very impatient with making a revolution. And some of it might have been the product of the 50s and the 60s and the TV commercials. We have been trained into buying instant coffee and minute rice, and we somehow expect an instant revolution, and it ain't gonna happen. So what I would say is that all of you, especially those of you who are so young,
I would like to, when I die, as I'm dying, my dream is to see you middle-aged and still optimistic and still saying our motto is organize, organize, organize.